We all have things in our life that are valuable to us in their own unique way, and they probably deserve a nicer resting place. That's why I made this beautiful little keepsake box, and in today's video I'm going to show you just how I made it. One of the coolest things that you're going to take away from this video is how to make this custom knob using only a drill press and your table saw. To get started, I prepared 2 pieces of walnut and 2 pieces of bird's eye maple to 3 5/8 inch wide, 6 inches long, and a 1/2 inch thick. As far as the joinery goes, I'm going to be making some perfect fitting dovetails using the multi-router. And I know this machine may look intimidating, but I promise the setup is extremely easy and we'll be cutting dovetails in no time. Best of all, the only layout work that's required to use this machine is a simple center line on your workpiece. Now you do want this line to be perfectly centered, so I like to make the same 1 13/16 inch mark from both sides to ensure I'm marking dead center. Next, we can go ahead and install the 1/2 inch tails template on the multi-router. Once it's installed, just slide the horizontal table forward until it's roughly an inch away from the vertical table, then lock the X-axis in place. Then maneuver the table so the stylus pin is in one of the 2 center slots on the template, and then lock both tables in place. With the machine practically all set up at this point, all that's left to do is to install a 1/2 inch 14-degree dovetail router bit into my router. Then I can reinstall my router and set the depth of cut to cut roughly a 32nd of an inch deeper than my material's thickness. With no further adjustments needed, I can pop on my dust cabinet and hook up my dust collection hose. The final bit of setup work is to align the center mark on my workpiece with the center mark on the vertical table. Then I can clamp it in place and ensure the workpiece is perfectly square to the table. Also, I'm clamping a scrap piece of wood against the right edge of my workpiece to act as a fence. And the position of this fence will remain the same throughout the entire process. To cut the tails, I'm maneuvering the vertical table up and down and the horizontal table left and right. With the stylus engaging the template, it's literally impossible for me to make a mistake at this point. I just continue down my board, following the template and cutting each tail until I've reached the end of my workpiece. To cut the other end, I can rotate the board around, keeping the same face pointing up, and then position it against my fence and vertical table, and repeat the cutting process. And in most cases, time is money, so to make this process go even faster, you can actually cut both of your tail boards at the same time by simply stacking them on top of each other. Now, this little trick is only possible when cutting the tails, since the dovetail bit is moving in a controlled, straight up and down direction. With both tail boards all finished being cut, we're now ready to switch over to the 1/2 inch pins template. I also need to take this time to swap out my router bit to an ultra shear 3/8 inch spiral upcut bit. Then I can reinstall my router and once again go ahead and set that depth to cut roughly a 32nd of an inch past my material thickness. And since I have that fence already set up, there's no layout work required here. I can just slide my material against the stop, clamp it in place, and I am good to go. Cutting the pins is just as easy as cutting the tails. Just maneuver the 2 tables to follow the template with the stylus, and you'll get perfect fitting pins in no time. Once one side is done, just rotate the workpiece to cut the other end, but make sure to keep that same face pointing up, just like we did with the tails board. Now there is some fine tuning here that can be done by simply adjusting the stylus pin's position up or down. But in this case, my stylus pin was already at the perfect height, since I always do dovetails on 1/2 inch thick material. But if you're ever setting up for dovetails, I do always recommend that you have a test workpiece available. This way you can dial in the perfect fit before going to your actual workpiece. And if you want to learn even more specific setup instructions when it comes to doing dovetails on the multi-router, I do have another video that covers that, and it'll be linked in the description below. With both the pins and tails now all cut, the next step was to glue everything together. I like to use the plastic end on this glue brush to spread a little glue on the pins and on the face of the tails before pressing the joint together. And one of my favorite things about this process is just how perfectly this joint comes together. There is absolutely zero cleanup work for me to do when these come off the multi-router. And the best part is it only takes me roughly 10 minutes to cut the joinery from beginning to end. And that is including all the setup time. The last little tip I want to share with you while I'm gluing up this box is how to go about cleaning up the glue squeeze out. All I do is take a wet rag and wipe it up, then come back with a wet toothbrush, and those two things together do a pretty great job of cleaning up the glue. With the box now all glued and assembled, I needed to add some clamps. And to ensure my box stays perfectly square while I add clamping pressure, I'm using these Clamping Squares Plus minis. These little guys have legs that are only 3 inches long, and they're perfect for little box glue-ups like this. And just to double check that everything did come out perfectly square, I like to check the box with my 4-inch precision triangle. The next step in the process was to route out a rabbet so we can go ahead and attach a 1/4-inch plywood bottom. And for that, I'm using our 3-flute carbide insert rabbeting bit with a 3/8-inch collar installed. And this bit is available with 7 different collars that gives you a rabbeting range from a 1/16 of an inch to a full 1/2 inch. I like to make this cut in 2 separate passes to get to my final depth of just a hair over a 1/4 inch. And I make sure to feed the box into the bit in a counterclockwise direction. Next, I can use my 12-inch woodworking rule to measure for what size I need to cut my bottom. And once I cut it to size, I like to test it to make sure it's going to fit. Now, since the corners of the rabbet are rounded, I have to round the plywood to match. And for that, I'm using this 3/4 inch radius quick jig and an ultra shear 1/4 inch flush trim bit. Using this jig is extremely simple. Just locate the shoulders of the jig against the edges of the workpiece, then set your bearing height to right against the jig, and you can flush trim all 4 corners to size. And if you cut your bottom to the correct size, it should pop in nice and snug, just like this. Now it's time for my absolute favorite step in this project, which is making this custom knob. First, begin by prepping 2 pieces of stock to 3/4 inches square and roughly 12 inches long. I'm using maple for my handle. Then lay out a line 5/8, 1 inch, and 1 3/4 inches from the top. This area right here is where our tenon will be, and this line is where we'll be drilling 1/2 of a 3/8 inch hole. And you may be wondering, how do you drill 1/2 a hole? Well, here's how. Just stack your boards up against each other and set your fence position so that the point of your 3/8 inch drill bit lines up with the seam of your 2 work pieces. Then just set your stop so you drill your hole at that 5/8 inch mark that we've made previously. Last thing before drilling, go ahead and clamp your 2 work pieces against your fence so that the pieces stay in place while we drill. And the height of this fence is one of the 2 reasons why I really like it, because it gives me something to clamp to, but the major reason I love this fence is the built-in dust collection that it provides. Anyway, once you're all done drilling your first hole, just rotate each piece, clamp them up, and continue drilling. You can repeat this process till all 4 of your holes are drilled, and you have a knob that looks somewhat like this. Next, I took it over to the workbench and laid out a 1/4 inch grid on the top of the knob and an 1/8 inch reference mark on the face that I'll use in just a minute to help with some machine setup. Lastly, I grabbed my bevel block and bevel gauge to lay out a 30-degree angle on my workpiece that lined up with my 1/4-inch reference marks. Then I also got to use my bevel gauge to help with setting up the angle on my table saw. I'll be cutting this angle on the knob on all 4 sides using our Stealth Stop miter gauge. One of the major bonuses of this tool is that it can be used on either side of the blade. I usually use my miter gauges on the left side of my blade, but whenever I'm making a beveled cut like this, I prefer my miter gauge on the right side instead. To cut the tenon, I switched over to this flat top grooving blade and set the height to that 1/8 inch layout mark that we made earlier. Then I lined up my workpiece where I wanted the tenon to start, set the stop, and made a pass on all 4 sides. Then I adjusted my workpiece to where I wanted the tenon to end, set the stop, and cut on all 4 sides again. Once I was all done, I flipped in the stop and cleared the remaining material away to finish making the tenon. Now for the lid of my box, I like it to have a 1/4 inch overhang on all 4 sides. So since my box measures 6 inches square, I cut my lid to 6.5 inches square and a 1/2 inch thick. Now to mount the knob, I'm going to be making a through mortise in the lid and using some wedge tenons to secure the knob in place. To begin the layout of my through mortise, I first marked a crosshair of center lines on both faces of the lid and on the end of the knob. Then I transferred the layout marks around to each face. Next, I used a square to help me line up the crosshairs on the knob with the crosshairs on the lid and marked out the perimeter of the tenon with a pencil. I did this on both sides since this will be a through mortise. Then I came back with a marking knife to mark out the mortises to give me a better physical reference for my chisels. The first chisel I'm using here is my 1/2 inch blue spruce chisel to make a chopping cut on all 4 edges of the mortise to define the perimeter. Then I made a slight paring cut to just begin the mortise. I repeated this process on both sides. To clear out the bulk of the waste, I marked center and drilled a 3/8 inch hole all the way through my lid. Now all I had to do was clear out the remaining material. And when I'm doing this, I like to start with a smaller 1/4 inch chisel and then slowly work my way up to a final 1/2 inch chisel. And I tried my best here to be as careful as possible by slowly removing as little material from each side and clearing out the mortise when it got full. Unfortunately though, right at the very edge, I had some chip out. Now I'm assuming this was just because of the type of grain I was working around that this happened, but looking back, I should have just glued that piece back in place. But once I saw that the shoulder of the knob was going to cover the mistake, I decided to just leave it and move on. To secure the knob to the lid, I'm going to be using a combination of some relief cuts on the tenon and then some wedges that I'll be able to pound in to firmly secure the tenon to the lid. And to make those relief cuts, I used this beautiful blue spruce carcass saw. There's actually several hand saws that are available now through Blue Spruce, and I think they're pretty impressive, and I highly recommend that you go check them out if you're into hand tools. Before I could continue and install the knob, I first had to add a 3/4 inch rabbet to the bottom of the lid so that it can nest inside the box. And to do that, I used this 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit in my router table. I first set my bit height to only an 1/8 inch high, and then I made some passes and adjusted my fence until I got the fit I was looking for. Then I raised the bit to its final height of a 1/4 inch and worked my way back to my starting point to finish cutting the rabbet on the lid. The last bit of decorative work that I chose to do to this lid was to add a slight chamfer to the bottom edges using my Easy Edge corner plane. This tool is extremely satisfying to use. It left me with a flawless finish and perfect chamfers that lined up all the way around the lid. At this point, I was now ready to make some wedges to attach the knob to my lid. And for that, I chose to use some 1/8 inch thick walnut scraps that were the same width as my tenon. To create the wedge shape, I just used some double-sided tape to hold the scrap pieces down, and then I hit it with my block plane until it tapered enough to fit nicely in the relief cuts on my tenon. And after all that hard work, I'm finally ready to attach the knob to the lid. I first put some glue in the mortise, then went ahead and used some CA glue to help secure the knob in a semi-permanent position while I flipped it over and clamped it in my vise to add the wedges. All it took was a little glue and a couple taps from my mallet, and the wedges were firmly installed. And to flush everything up, I used this neat little flush cutting saw and my orbital sander to give it a nice smooth finish. The very last step before sanding and finishing was to install the bottom, and to do this I'm using a combination of Titebond 3 and some Starbond CA glue. The Titebond glue is what gives it strength, and the CA glue provides an instant bond to act as a clamp while the wood glue sets up and dries. For the finish, I went with some natural Watco Danish oil, followed by a few coats of paste wax. And I am absolutely thrilled with how this little box turned out. The knob is definitely my favorite part of the whole thing, since it was my first time trying something like that, and I just love the way it elevates the entire piece. If you'd like to build this exact box, or something similar, there's a very detailed free plan over on our blog, and that's linked directly below this video. Also, if you're curious about any of the tools that you saw me use here today, and you want to add them to your shop, there's a full list of all those tools below. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I would love to hear any feedback you have in the comments below. Thanks so much guys for watching, and I'll see you next time here on RedTOOL Woodshop.